All right. All right. All right. All right. Let's see if anybody can hear me. Hello. 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 All right. Press 1 if you can hear me, if you would, whoever is listening. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Make sure now that we're live in case I need to shut it off and try again. Can you hear me? Hello. Hello. Testing 1, 2, testing. I'm going to assume that you can hear me. All right, everyone. Welcome to this spontaneous broadcast from the trenches of online social media, online apologetics. The topic for today is something that I've been meditating on for some time, ever since watching the debate, so-called, between Mohammad Hijab and Apostate Prophet. And I have decided to do this broadcast as a response to the critical moment in the debate that I thought really was the center of this particular engagement, this ambush that we all witnessed, where it was asked by Mohammad Hijab if the apostate prophet was a philosophical moralist, either of the objective or subjective flavor. When apostate prophet began to explain his position, Mohammad Hijab cut him off. We were not really given a chance to hear him, and then created a straw man fallacy, the likes of which I have not seen attempted in public discourse in many years. I honestly think that Mohammad Hijab has Venom Fang X in the running for champion of online apologetics on YouTube. The straw man argument that was created by one Mohammad Hijab was to force the topic of utilitarianism into the discourse, something that was not mentioned by apostate prophet, but was created by Mohammad Hijab in order to waste everyone's time with him spouting his own knowledge, so-called. Now, his followers and his fans are repeating what they have learned from their teacher, which is that philosophy can simply be boiled down to, quote, objective and subjective philosophy, whether we're talking about morals or not specifically. Because like philosophy, I would argue, before you even get into, before you even get into the topic of morals, where must you begin? You must begin at the beginning. What is the beginning? The beginning is the Greeks, arguably, or the Egyptians, or the Mesopotamians. But for the sake of this conversation, this lecture, like any good philosophy student or teacher or scholar knows, we have been tasked with the dualistic conundrum that exists in our species philosophy, which is the notion that one finger points to the heavens while the other points to the earth. In the famous painting done by Raphael, if I'm not mistaken. Enshrined in that Renaissance era painting, embodied the symbol of our philosophical discourse that we've inherited since time immemorial. Do we derive understanding of ourselves and our purpose from things strictly, or from a source outside of ourselves, or is it possible to derive answers to why we are the way we are from an internal, subjective, first experienced then spoken point of view. That is the summary difference, arguably, between the two great philosophers so called in Islamic philosophical books. The two greats were Plato and Aristotle. You cannot claim to be an expert in philosophy until you have wrapped your head around what I have just said. If you cannot, I would strongly advise you to pause, switch off, do what must be done, and educate yourself fully on this. You don't need a degree. You don't need to have a teacher. You just need your own imagination, your own willingness. That's it. That is it, I can assure you. Beyond this point, the only other things I'm going to say is that there have been a history, as demonstrated through all philosophical discourse in this discipline, that the arguments or the exploration of these two choices demonstrated by Plato and Aristotle is been expanded upon, debated, argued, etc. for centuries now. But what was asked by Mohammad Hijab over and over, and his fans continue to ask over and over, is there not a third option? They mock those who would ask, is there something beyond the strict, artificial, dualistic options? Is that it? Dare we ask, is there a third force or a fourth force? And I would argue that the direct rebuttal to Muhammad Hijab's strawman fallacies lies in the philosophies of pragmatism and existentialism. These two philosophies bring in, beyond just these rambling, at times incoherent statements about objectivity and subjectivity, and bring in two vital principles, two other disciplines to assist in the philosophical discourse. Namely, in the case of pragmatism, as demonstrated by William James, psychology. Psychology comes to bear as a sister discipline of philosophy. And why is that important? Because even the Islamic philosophers of old knew this truth. They wrote about it, did they not? How is that deniable? Existentialism is brought in by the fourth force, as it represents a critical integration of what is called phenomenology. That is what is brought to bear. The idea of gnosis and experience as being vital to the understanding of how we derive meaning and purpose for ourselves and how we come about with our own ideas and purpose. This is most enshrined by the Jewish psychoanalyst and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. That right there, I would suggest, regardless of whether we're going to take the next step into morals as a topic of philosophy, we must start with this basic fact that before we can even proceed, we must have a bearing on the foundations of how one does begin the act of philosophizing. Once you have picked one of these four options, you then can ask the question about morals. You have to admit that you are picking one of these four doors. And yes, can you come out from these four doors? Most certainly. You can go into any one you wish. You don't even need to stay. In fact, you can stay in the waiting room if you wish. But visualize that, if you will. Now, when you go into one of the rooms, there are various topics that each one can talk about. Morals just happens to be one of the things in each one of the 4 rooms. So already you have to understand that you are looking at morals from one of these 4 foundations, and that even when you pick morals as the specific subject of focus within that room, you have to reckon with the reality that using that one room, there are all this furniture, right? It's not just a blank room with just morals sitting there on the countertop. There are, just like in any well-stocked room, imagine anything, multiple things, furniture, objects, books that testify to the attempts throughout history of what people have done in that one room, with that one object that we are calling, in this analogy, morals. Some people in this room, some people in the waiting room are spending a lot of time in the objective room, and they are trying to convince us and bully us that the only way to have an understanding of objective morality is through Islam, specifically the Sunni, Salafi, Hanbali perspectives, as far as I can tell. Not ignoring the rest of their tradition, ignoring all these other things, ignoring all the other options. There might be others, and perhaps Apostate Prophet, I cannot speak for him, but perhaps he represents this particular perspective of being in the subjective room. The subjective room. And perhaps we might say that the Apostate Prophet, because we still don't know we still just don't know what his perspective is on all of this yet, that maybe he is dealing with things in that perspective. But until we know, it is futile to hyper-focus on just one, and it is ignorant to think that there are only 2. Here's some food for thought. Thank you for watching. Peace be with you all.